Imagine a war that raged for over 3 centuries, yet not a single drop of blood was shed. A conflict that spanned 335 years, yet claimed no lives, destroyed no cities, and left no scars on the battlefield. It sounds impossible, a historical paradox almost too strange to be true, but it happened. Welcome to the astonishing story of the 135 Years' War. More accurately, the 335 Years' War, between the tiny European states of the Dutch Republic and the Isles of Scilly. The year was 1651. Europe was in turmoil. England had just undergone a bloody civil war. The monarchy was toppled, and Oliver Cromwell was asserting control over a fractured nation. Meanwhile, far to the southwest, off the coast of Cornwall, a small archipelago called the Isles of Scilly was strategically significant despite its tiny population. The islands had long served as a haven for royalist supporters of the deposed King Charles I, and even after his execution, local leaders continued to resist the new regime. It all started with a simple political disagreement, a common enough trigger for wars. But here's the twist. The Dutch, one of the most formidable naval powers of the 17th century, were drawn into the conflict. Not because they had armies stationed on the islands, but because the Isles of Scilly became a hotspot for piracy that threatened Dutch shipping. Trade routes were sacred, and the Dutch were fiercely protective of them. So a war was officially declared, and the Dutch and the Scilly Islands were technically at war, from 1651 all the way to 1986. Yes, you heard that right, 335 years of war. Now, don't picture cannonballs flying or armies clashing. This war was peculiar because it was entirely symbolic. There were no battles, no treaties, and no casualties. In fact, the conflict began and ended almost entirely on paper. The Dutch never launched an attack, and the Scilly Islands were too small and peaceful to mount any defense. It was a war that existed only in the bureaucratic sense, a paperwork war that lingered quietly through centuries of European history. What makes this story even more fascinating is how the war eventually ended. By the 20th century, the notion that England and the Isles of Scilly were still technically at war with the Netherlands seemed absurd to historians and diplomats alike. The misunderstanding had been perpetuated by a combination of oversight, lack of communication, and the slow churn of official documentation. Nobody had actually checked whether the war had ended because, frankly, it didn't matter. Nobody was fighting, nobody was threatening each other, and life on the Isles of Scilly went on as it had for centuries. It wasn't until 1986 that a Dutch ambassador, preparing a speech and doing some routine research, realized that formally, the war had never been concluded. The ambassador contacted the British Foreign Office, and a formal peace treaty was signed. Not with fanfare, not with parades, but with quiet diplomacy. The 335-year war was officially over. Think about that for a moment. A war that began in the age of muskets and sailboats ended in an era of personal computers and mobile phones. 3 centuries and more than 3 decades of hostilities existed without a single person being harmed, a single building being destroyed, a single cannon fired. It's a striking reminder that sometimes the absurdity of history can be as fascinating as its violence. The story also reveals a lot about human nature. It's easy to imagine war as inevitable whenever nations disagree. Yet this bizarre conflict shows that sometimes wars can be forgotten, ignored, or simply survive because no one bothers to end them. The 135 or 335 Years' War reminds us that history isn't always about epic battles or legendary generals. Sometimes it's about paperwork, miscommunication, and the sheer endurance of absurdity over centuries. And yet this war also raises questions. How many other conflicts might have existed quietly, unnoticed, because they didn't fit our conventional ideas of war? How much of history is quietly forgotten, lingering like a shadow until someone finally bothers to check? The Isles of Scilly, serene and untouched, are a testament to the fact that even in times of turmoil, peace can exist, sometimes accidentally, sometimes absurdly, and sometimes for over 3 centuries. By the time the peace treaty was signed in 1986, the world had changed beyond recognition. Europe had seen revolutions, empires rise and fall, and 2 world wars. Yet somewhere in the administrative archives, a war had quietly persisted, unnoticed, unchallenged, and entirely bloodless. So the next time you think of war, remember this peculiar chapter in history. A war that spanned lifetimes and eras, yet left no scars. A war fought not with swords or guns, but with the inertia of bureaucracy and human oversight. The 335-year war stands as a reminder that history isn't always about blood and battles. It's also about the strange, the unexpected, and the downright absurd. It's a story that makes you laugh, think, and marvel at the peculiar ways the world has unfolded. And perhaps in a world so often dominated by conflict, it's a small but enduring hope that sometimes even a war can exist without suffering, without destruction, and without a single casualty. History, after all, isn't always what you expect, and sometimes it's downright bizarre.